English here, and I serve as the headmaster. And I am pleased to present this program tonight that was actually suggested to me by one of our students. And he said that you know both Governor Haslam and the writer John Meacham, and he said, why don't you just ask them to come do a program? And I thought to myself, sure, that is easy to do. Well, I wrote both of them, and within minutes they wrote me back and said we would be glad to. Governor Haslam has been around the school a number of times, and have enjoyed meals with him here on the campus and have appreciated his interest in the school and its mission. And John Meacham's son graduated this past year, and I was really pleased to get to know Sam both as a student here and in general and then in an English class. And so I've been really grateful to both of them for their willingness to be here tonight. I asked Mark Tipps, who serves here as the athletic director, but prior to that, Mark was a lawyer for 30 years, and a number of those years while he was a lawyer, he was in the D.C. area working with Bill Frist, working with two other senators who escaped, Lamar Alexander and Fred Thompson. And he also worked with Lamar, I think, when he was running for president. And so I thought Mark would be good to prompt them, even though John was very glad to prompt each other with questions tonight. And so please join me in thanking our friends, Bill Haslam and John Meacham, for being here.
Can I just jump in and say, I think that, Brad, you need to be commended.
Normally you wait to be introduced, but go ahead.
I do. But I think this is really generous-spirited of MBA, to have a Macaulay guy, but most important, to lift up a Webb guy who's had a hard time in life. He hasn't done much, and so he's overcoming this educational deficit. And I think it's important, and I want to thank you all for that.
Well, I want to echo what Brad said. Thank you both for being here. I really do.
We're going to be serious now.
It's great for you to be here and take the time and to talk to us about what I think is an important topic on everybody's mind. To sort of start you off, I was looking at some statistics, which are always dangerous to look at, but there was a Pew Research Institute study done that was pretty in-depth. I won't bore you with the details other than to say in the last 20 or 25 years, the people who identify as strongly conservative or strongly liberal has doubled, and the percentage of people who are Republicans who view Democrats as very dangerous, and the percentage of Democrats who view Republicans as very dangerous has more than doubled since 1994. And so I think a starting point would be, why are we seeing such increased partisanship? Why are we seeing sort of the ideological silos that I think we're seeing in the last 20 years? What has changed to cause that?
Go ahead, John.
You're exactly right on the statistics. My favorite way of thinking about this, to use a local example, is in 1990, Al Gore ran for his second term in the Senate, and if anyone here can name Al Gore's challenger in 1990, Haslam will buy you a bottle of whiskey. Because let me tell you, Al Gore couldn't. I asked him recently. He could not, and I can promise you, as Bill will tell you, politicians tend to remember things like that. He was running in 1990. Al Gore, 30 years ago, carried all 95 counties in the state of Tennessee. 8 years later, losing the state cost him the presidency, because if he'd carried Tennessee, Florida wouldn't have mattered. So if you do what I do, that's a fairly interesting case study. So you think something happened in those 10 years, right? But Clinton and Gore carried the state in 92 and in 96. So that narrows our field of inquiry. Something happened between 96 and 2000. One thing is that George W. Bush was a good candidate for Tennessee. Good. That takes nothing away from President Bush to talk like this. But one thing that was different is in 1996, Fox News debuted. And suddenly, if you were interested in politics in the way and people are interested, sports folks are interested in ESPN, you had a place to go. And I think it began, whether this is an amplifier or an amplifying or a creative force, I'm not sure, but it is one of the few things that you can at least say is a correlation, and it might be causative. More broadly, I think that this country functionally, as we know it, is only 56 years old. That forget about 1619, forget about 1776, 1865. 1965 marks the beginning of this democracy for two reasons. One, the Voting Rights Act. So for the first time, it was actually a federally mandated integrated electorate. The first integrated presidential election in American history was in 1968, 50 years ago. So that's one thing. The other is President Johnson signed the Nationality Act, which repealed the 1920s isolationist and nativist quotas. Those quotas are what prevented us from receiving more refugees from Nazi Germany. It raised the number of immigrants who could come in. The country began to change quite radically. I think in many ways it took about 30 or 40 years for those demographic changes to become evident. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in polarization from the perspective of the right is that they would like to have an America that they think they remember. And I think on the left, you have a tendency to a kind of intellectual self-satisfaction that forecloses the capacity for necessary democratic lowercase d compromise.
So I think John's right, but I'd put a few other force multipliers in there. With Fox, you did have, for the first time, the ability to choose your news that you didn't have before that. The ABC, CBS, NBC were pretty much going to give you the same perspective on news. And that opened the floodgates for now however many cable channels you can get. And then that gets multiplied again by social media, right? Because now you really can filter it just the way you want. And you, not just you filtering it, but then it filters for you, right? Your phone figures out what you click on, and then it's going to feed you more of that. And so all of that happened, so much so that the point you made today about how hardened the sides have gotten against each other, there's something called motivation, attribution, asymmetry, which means how much you think the other side is not just wrong, but they're bad. And this is 4 years ago, so you know it's worse now. The motivation, attribution, asymmetry in the United States between Republicans and Democrats was greater than that between Palestinians and Israelis 4 years ago, so you know it's worse now. And I think there's another cause. The country is really evenly split, but because we can choose our news, we don't really think we're split, right? So if you think about it, I think I got my math right. Since 1988, there have been 8 presidential elections. Nobody has gotten more than 53% of the vote in any of those 8 presidential elections. In the 8 before that, I think 5 of the 8 were decided by somebody got more than 53%. So you had Nixon, LBJ, I'm going to miss somebody, but Bush in 88. But
You're right enough.
You see, directionally. So the point would be, as a country, we've actually, while the sides have hardened, we've gotten more evenly split. Biden wins a fairly narrow election. The House is 6-7 seats different. The Senate is 50-50. And yet, because we only listen to folks who think like we do, we're pretty sure that there's a big majority on our side and the other folks are wrong.
What do you guys think about, when I look at it, my first foray into politics was George Herbert Walker Bush's reelection in '92, and then that led me into Bill Frist getting elected in '94. In those late '80s, early '90s, you could flip on the TV, and you could see some fairly decent debates on TV. Larry King used to host a great show where he would usually have people from both sides, and the discussion was pretty solid. And when I watch it now, which is fairly rare, it's clear to me that they're just looking to have as many people yelling at each other as possible. There's very little discussion. What has changed to where now we seem to only want to hear what we want to hear as opposed to seeking out alternative views and being interested in what other people have to say?
I would just make one amendment, and Mark, of course, went to Baylor for part of the time, so it's also diversity, so well done. I think that it's not that you turn on and they yell at each other. You turn on and they're yelling at you.
Yes.
And that is different. I think one of the most important, when we all turn into the Planet of the Apes and Statue of Liberty is on the beach and they're trying to figure out how this happened, one of the big moments, I think, will be when Roger Ailes, the founder of Fox, realized that when people saw something on the news, it had a particular credibility. So think about it. The visual vernacular of the news is a man or a woman sitting at a desk into a camera with an image behind them, right? What is Fox primetime? What is MSNBC primetime? What is CNN primetime? It's not Larry King, who sat across a table from somebody. It's not the Capitol gang. It's not Crossfire. It is a person telling you the truth as they see it. And there is still something in the American psyche, for at least for folks my age and older, there are a few still left, that see that as the news. And I think that creates a kind of crisis of authority, I think. Why is it? It is purely economic. It is economic. Because the fastest way not to go on television or to get someone not to watch is to say, I'm of two minds about that. Because nobody cares if you're of two minds about it. They want, I believe the current media system largely rewards speed. You have to have an opinion instantly, no matter whether it's worth having or not. Hyperbole and predictability. People are not turning on Fox to see, I wonder if the president did something good today. People do not turn on MSNBC to say, I wonder if Kevin McCarthy had a good day. And it's to Bill's point, it is a kind of self-selection. And it's very hard to put that particular Humpty Dumpty back again. Let me just quickly say, too, though, when we had the Cronkite era, which of fabled memory, that was the exception that proves the rule. Because we had partisan newspapers from the 18th century, the 19th century, into the early 20th century. It wasn't until the progressive era that newspapers kind of took on this honest broker role. So this is a return, in many tragic ways, to, say, the 1850s. Because let me tell you, there were not a lot of abolitionists in Massachusetts reading the Charleston Mercury. And there were not a lot of slave owners in South Carolina reading the Liberator. And there are implications to that I think are very profoundly disturbing.
Two comments. Number one, I think you're right. The basic media model is outrage, right? If I can get you mad enough, then you're going to watch it again, to hear it again, because you're going to say, right, you're right. Finally, somebody has got it right, and I'm going to watch more. I was flipping through the TV the other night about 10 o'clock, and somebody on Fox was tearing into President Biden. And I thought, if you're watching Fox at 10 o'clock at night, there's zero chance that you're trying to decide if you like President Biden or not. Okay, and the flip side of that's true too, right? So a little while later, I flipped to CNN, and they were, they were going after, this is 2 weeks ago, and they were going after Trump. And I'm thinking, same thing. At 10:15 at night, if you're watching CNN, you probably aren't deciding whether Trump was a good president or not. I think here's the other thing, and I'm going to put this a little bit as a question. Here's the other reason I think that's true, is there is no incentive to be of two minds and try to weigh a difficult issue. There is zero incentive to try to solve a complex problem because, okay, a little bit more than zero, but not much, because of this. If I said, what's the official immigration policy of the United States? We don't have one. And why don't we have one? We don't have one for two reasons. One, it's really hard. I've said, let's come up with a policy that's humane and yet respects our borders. That's going to take some compromise on both sides to actually work that out, right? I mean, that's not going to be we can't sit down here in 20 minutes and figure that out. The second reason is both sides make money off of that, right? If you're a Republican, you have gotten a mailer sometimes saying Democrats are for opening up the border. And if you're a Democrat, you've gotten one that says Republicans are for putting children in cages. And both sides are doing really well with that. But there doesn't seem to be much incentive for weighing the other side of the issue. My political mentor was Howard Baker, and Baker had a saying that always remember the other fella might be right. But we're in an environment that doesn't reward you for thinking the other fella might be right. So recent phenomena are always been true.
Always true. The difference is, well, always largely true. If you look at the big things we've done, let's just say since World War II, the Interstate Highway Bill is and the one exception to this in our time is the infrastructure bill in the Senate. It got 68 votes. That's like getting 113 votes, if you adjust for madness. Mitch McConnell voted for it, right? I mean, that's okay.
This is the $1 trillion bill. It's passed in the Senate and waiting in the House to see what happens. Right.
Correct. But he got it. He got 68 votes. Almost impossible. But if you look at the interstate highways, if you look at the GI Bill, if you look at the funding after Sputnik for science and defense education, if you look at defense budgets, you look at Social Security expansion and protection, you look at Medicare, prescription drugs, you get about 60 votes. Pat Moynihan drove the Clintons crazy when he pointed out that you should not try to do a massive health care bill on a 51-49 vote, that you need a little bit more just to say this is actually the national will. And so it's become harder. I would say it's harder. One of the things I try to argue, and it's hard given that I only think about the 1930s, is that I would urge everybody, when you're wrestling with these questions, not to believe that there was a once upon a time, that if there are 3 or 4 steps we take, we can then get back to a moment where things worked. A couple of reasons. One is before 1964 and 65, if you were a person of color, you wouldn't have wanted it to work. Before 1921, if you were a woman, you were disenfranchised. Before 2015, if you were not of a heterosexual straight orientation, you had fewer civil rights. That may sound partisan, but it's not. My fundamental belief, there's some nodding, my fundamental belief about the country is that we've always grown stronger and freer the more widely we've opened our arms. And I'm right, because we're the most powerful nation in the world still. And we are, at this point, the freest. And so you can't really argue with that. I mean, you can try, but I'm happy to have that argument. What that means, I believe, is that to whom much is given, much is expected. Haslam didn't say it first, Jesus did, but Haslam likes to, borrow from the good guys. I think civility is essential because, and it's not just politeness, civility is at the heart of a moral view of the world in which we see each other not as adversaries, but as neighbors. And neighbors can disagree. Neighbors don't have to like each other. What you do if you're a neighbor, and remember, what did Jesus say? do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He did not say, do unto others because it's the right thing to do. He left the moral part out. It's a covenant. It's pragmatic. And it's the only way a democracy works, because democracy is counterintuitive. Why should I help you? I need some more grain. I need a couple of extra rocks to hit the dinosaur over the head. The social contract is counterintuitive. And so there's no reason democracy should last. Quite the opposite. The natural default position of human society is authoritarianism. You follow a strong person because the strong person promises they're going to keep the predators away. Not the hockey people, maybe them too, I don't know. But this is so important right now, and it's so hard. If I showed you all email I got today, you would be horrified from people who think I'm a crazy socialist. I know I look like one, right?
Can I jump in and say on this, John, let's pick up with something you said a few minutes ago about the consequences that flow from the increased partisanship and the lack of civility that we see. When I was Fred Thompson's counsel on the Chinagate hearings, we were looking at why the Chinese government wanted to influence our 1996 elections. And I remember looking at some intelligence stuff, which has all been declassified years ago. And there were young leaders in China who said, well, their system's wide open. If you put money in, it's like a slot machine. Put it in, you get the result you need. And they had older military leaders who said, you don't need to do all that. They're going to collapse from within the next 100 years. And I worry that the path we're on does begin to mirror and look like the America of the 1850s. What are the short-term and long-term consequences if we don't make some corrective actions in our political discourse?
Well, Bill's been in the arena, thank God. He governed with grace and dignity and skill, and I miss him every day. And I say that without the usual irony.
I'm hoping somebody's recording this.
No, I mean it. And again, I will deny it that I said it. Christy, I never said it. But seriously, but Haslam's like a pterodactyl. I mean, he's a polite, thoughtful politician. That's like John Kennedy said the reason Profiles in Courage was only one volume is he had no more material, right? I mean, this is not. It's like the best restaurant in the hospital. There aren't many. So that's important. A year ago, I would have given you a different answer. I was very struck by the events of January 6th because it actually hadn't occurred to me that a group of Americans would storm their own capital. It just hadn't. And we know now, even more than we knew then, about how close we came and how involved the former president was in trying to subvert a free and fair election. And the polls say that 60% of Republicans think the election was stolen. I don't actually believe that. I think they're just telling pollsters that to troll them, honestly. If they do, then it's a big data point in what you're saying. Bill said Biden had won a narrow victory. That's true. But it was greater than or equal to Harry Truman's, John Kennedy's, Richard Nixon's the first time, Jimmy Carter's, and more, significantly more, than 4 of the elections you were talking about since 1992. So it's fully within the mainstream of pretty clear wins. So the scary data point for the trajectory, to me, is insurrection. The good news is that 81 million people looked at the evidence of the last 4 years and said, no, I want to try something else. And guess what? in 36 months, we'll do it again. And that's what we're supposed to do. That was the debate in Philadelphia in 1787. And I'm a firm believer, I'm going to quote my son here, who pointed out that part of being an athlete, which no Meacham is in danger of doing at all, is you respect the rules. You listen to, you don't get to the bottom of the ninth, and because you're down by 2 and you lost 2 in the 7th, you say, oh, the 7th inning didn't happen. That doesn't work. And then you just go and you do it again. And so I do think the good news here is that I think there's about, and I'm making this number up, but I think there's probably 30% of the country will believe anything, and often do. 30% believe something else. I do think there's 30% that is movable. They're not self-identified Democrats, they're not self-identified Republicans, but the independents are growing. The generational thing is important. The geography of the Constitution and the infrastructure of American democracy makes that more complicated.
I will note that the Sewanee grad had a 30, a 30, and a 30. That's 90. Do you have somewhere where the other 10 are?
I left 10 at Pilot.
Anyway, I do think you're right. Here's what concerns me. If you look at it, actually, the folks who are kind of consider themselves independent, the numbers are growing. And so you might say, well, that's a good thing, right? If you're looking for better outcomes. Here's my concern is, you still get elected in this country by coming through a party. And as more people say, I've had enough of that, I'm checking out, then it's leaving those folks on the edges of each party to control who the nominee is. And it means that's the folks that are putting up yard signs and putting on bumper stickers and encouraging folks to run or whatever it would be. My concern is that what we might think is good news is, well, the independents are growing just means they're checking out of the process until the last minute, at which point I'd say your influence is limited to just that vote.
That's good.
So that gets to the ideological silo issue, and I tend to agree with you, Governor. I think even though there are a good number of people, whether it's 50% or maybe 39% who are in the middle, I don't think that middle is as vocal as it used to be. I think they see the screaming going on each side, and they say, I don't want any part of that.
Absolutely.
I'm getting out of this.
What possible good is it to talk about politics?
So, but when you do that, you get to Bill's point, you've created a vacuum, and that vacuum gets filled, frankly, by some of the lowest common denominator, and now you just have the people who are involved in the parties, are giving the money, that are working, are pushing the candidates. If you're going to run for a statewide office and you're in a primary, if you're a Republican, you're going to have to tack hard to the right in this state, even if you don't necessarily view yourself there. And that's what I see happening to a lot of our politicians who may be more in the middle, but by the time they're elected, they're either pushed far to the right or far to the left, and then they have to answer to that. What do we do about that?
You're the guy who's running primaries.
Punt?
Yeah, well, I still think this. I still think there is room for that person who goes and runs, even in a primary, even in a state. Like I said, you're right. I mean, I ran in 2010, and the Republican Party's at a really different place in Tennessee than it was in 2010.
You're a pterodactyl, I'm telling you.
That's what my grandkids say. But I would argue the Democrat Party is as well. And maybe I'm hopelessly naive, but I still think there's room for somebody to say, here's why I'm running, here's the problems I want to solve, here's what I believe, and to do that in an effective way. Now, maybe I'm, like I said, hopelessly naive.
In Tennessee, you think?
I do. It'll be hard. It'd be really hard, but I still think there's room to do that. Not as easy as it was 11 years ago.
Does it concern either of you? My political past, I was a creature of the Senate. So when I see Republicans or Democrats toying with the filibuster rule and really what separates the Senate from the House and makes the Senate a minority body, not a majoritarian body. You know, Franklin described the Senate as the saucer that catches the milk that overflows from the cup that's the House. When you start talking about getting rid of the filibuster rule, getting rid of the 60 vote requirement, you're fundamentally changing our country and our government in pretty substantial ways, and yet both parties have talked about it and both parties have done it with respect to judges. Is that a dangerous path that they're on, and should we be concerned about that?
I say yes. I think the filibuster does give you a big hurdle to get over, but I think if you're making those large directional changes for the country, that's a worthy hurdle to get over. And you don't like it when you're in power, but I think, again, it shows that working out, making hard choices is really hard in government. But if we're going to make big directional decisions for the country, which is what the Senate does, I think the filibuster should stay in place.
Well, it's about 100 years old, so it hasn't been there from the beginning. The word means pirate. It's from the Dutch and the Spanish, meaning somebody who takes over a ship and takes the treasure away. William Walker of Nashville was one of the great filibusters of the 19th century. He went down, invaded Nicaragua, took it over, and reinstituted slavery. So there's not a noble history here to it. The longest filibuster in modern history was 74 days of the Civil Rights Bill. So I'm not a senator. There's no danger that I will be, thankfully, for the Republic. I worry that if you don't debate it and you don't think about it, you may let a noble instinct, which I think both of you have articulated, be an accelerant to a more cataclysmic event. Because right now, and Bill may disagree, I don't think he would, he might publicly, but I don't think in his heart. I set you up there. The Democratic Party could move away from a fact-based view of the world tonight. They could do it tomorrow, but they haven't done it yet. The arguments that the Democratic Party is putting forward, and I say this as a historian and as somebody who has voted for more Republicans than I have Democrats, they are part of a coherent debate in this country. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have clear analogs in progressive senators and legislators going back 150 years. What is unusual about what we're talking about is that the other party, the Republican Party, now listen to me carefully if you would, as currently constituted and run, the Republican Party at the national level is not a coherent force for an ongoing kind of American governance. They are about stopping things. They may want to stop them, and that's fully within their constitutional remit. But if you continue to argue that the incumbent president is not legitimately elected, and you continue to stop efforts at trying to figure out how the Capitol got stormed, you are forfeiting, it seems to me. You are not playing as constructive a role in the life of the nation as you should.
John and I have had this discussion in different ways. You said, well, the Republicans have abandoned this idea of truth or this threat of truth.
I said they are in flight from fact.
Okay. I would argue they're not alone in that. I agree with you, by the way, on January 6th. But I look at the Democrats' line now saying, listen, we can do this, $8 trillion worth of new proposals, okay? And we can do that if we'll just make the billionaires pay their fair share, okay? to run all of government, your local, your state, your federal government, you take it all together, it's a little bit more than $8 trillion, okay, to run all of government, okay? And remember, we have $8 trillion in new proposals. If you went to every billionaire and said, we get it all, not just what you earn, but we get everything you own. We're going to take all that, okay? And just proposing that wouldn't collapse the stock market and do everything else, and you're taking away everything else. But just say you said everything you have is ours. That's $4 trillion. Okay, so that funds half of a year of government. Okay, so I hear you. I'm with you. The fact that we're kidding, that some people are saying this election was stolen, I think is incredibly harmful.
Some people, the minority, the leader of your party in the House of Representatives is saying.
Listen, I can't defend that.
It's not like somebody down at Starbucks you just ran across.
Okay, but you're the
Ooh, watch it.
Okay,
watch it.
well, watch it or not. Watch it or not.
Go ahead. Go for it.
Okay.
Go for it.
Somebody who you've actively supported for president.
I do.
And is out saying, we can do all this. We can do all this, and it won't cost you a thing. This is all free. It won't cost a thing. And it's just not right.
I want you all to pay, if you would, think about the last 3.5 minutes, because this is why Bill Haslam is a great communicator and great politician. I mean that. And I say this with love and civility. That's a coherent argument. That's an argument about policy. That is what we're supposed to have. That's not
True.
What the people who are in power in your party are doing. They're just not.
Listen, I talked about the Republicans. It's just kind of like comparing two drunk sailors and saying which one's, had more to drink, because our side.
That's what they're saying right now.
But our side has been just as bad, right? I mean, you had. Think back to 2010. That was the Tea Party, and that was Republicans saying government's gotten too big, and they're taxing enough, and we have to stop that. And then what happened, and people on my team, the red jerseys, were saying, we just need to make government not be so big. And that there was this idea that it's all kind of waste, fraud, and abuse, and if we can cut that out. And then somebody kind of did the math, and they said, well, no, actually, 70% of what we spend is all in the entitlements. It's all Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And the Republicans looked around, and you had Paul Ryan kind of sitting there with charts and saying, this doesn't work. We're going to crash with these entitlements in the way they're growing. And then you had Republicans come along, and President Trump was one of those that goes, I am not going to touch any of that, but I'm not going to raise your taxes. And we fell for it too. And so, like I said, we're not any better. But this whole idea that there's this thread of truth that's been lost, I would make an argument that as a country, we've, you were quoting Jesus before. There's a verse in the Old Testament that says, for truth has stumbled in the public square. And we've lost this idea of actual facts and what works because the red button issues work so well.
Do you genuinely believe, and this is not a setup question, do you genuinely see moral equivalence between the arguments over the legitimacy of the election and the political debates over these spending packages?
It's hard. I mean, it's a great question. It's like which sin is worse, and I don't know that I can. I don't know that I can say. Listen. I do. When you had a relatively small group of people say we're going to overthrow the popular vote of the country, we're going to go storm the Capitol, see if we can kill the vice president, and take Nancy Pelosi hostage. That's about as bad a day as it gets for the country. I will agree with you on that. But I also can't say it's. I mean. Again, I hate to be the math geek, but when World War II ended, our deficit was at about 106% of GDP, which is where we are today. But the path we're already on for 10 years from now, this is without all the added spending packages that are being debated now, is to be at 200% of GDP in 10 years. Okay, that's the path we're already on before all this spending. Okay. Do you remember several years ago when everybody was worried about Greece and having to bail out Greece? They were at 200% of GDP. Okay, so that we're already aiming past that. So again, I don't know if it's the moral equivalent or not, but it's I think we have to be back to talking about, it's really nice to say we're going to have all these things free, but not be realistic and say somehow we got to pay for it.
Let's move for a second. We've got a lot of young folks in here. In fact, the whole idea of this was originated with some of our students. And we debate this in my American government class. I teach a bunch of seniors, and I can outline the problem for them pretty easily. And then they say, well, what do we do to fix that, Coach? That's a little tougher. So what solutions do you guys see? I tell them, you've got to get involved in politics. Doesn't mean you have to run for office, but if you ignore this and say this is someone else's mess, the lowest common denominator will fill the void, and you will not be happy with what you see on either side of the aisle. You've got to get involved. You have got to be willing to listen to the other side and understand where they're coming from and do it in depth, and do not get your news off of this contraption that takes you about 20 seconds to look at. Howard Baker, who was your political mentor and a guy that I got to spend some time with, used to say that great leaders had to be eloquent listeners. And I do not see any of the leaders, I know the minority leader, but I do not see, bless his heart, him or anyone over on the House side or anyone else listening on either side of the aisle to each other anymore. They just talk past each other. What do we do, and what would you say to these young people can be done to change this direction, or is this a hopeless situation?
Well, I'll go first. I don't think it's hopeless, but I think you have to start with, you made a really good point. You have to start by realizing who is not going to save us, okay? The political parties aren't going to all of a sudden come to their senses and say, oh, we haven't been having the right debate. That's not their job. The Republican Party's job is to elect Republicans, the Democrat, that's what they do. It is also not the media's job to set up the argument in a thoughtful way. Their job is to drive people to their site or their TV or their news, whatever it is. That's their job. So to think that somehow the media is going to straighten out the country is just not right. I know it, again, maybe hopelessly naive, but I think it starts with folks like us saying, I am going to quit listening so much to the rhetoric and actually look at the resume and see, has this person actually ever solved a problem before? Because that government is about how we make up the rules for how we're going to live together. That's what it's about, whether you're electing SGA reps at NBA or the school board or the President of the United States. How are we going to live together in the best way? And we've, like I said, unfortunately, there's no premium at all put now on problem solving. It works to your detriment. And so find those people to help, even if you don't agree 100% with them, but find those people to help in running for things who you said, you know what, I think they'll actually have the courage to try to solve a problem and then go from there.
I totally agree. I think we have to incentivize what we want. We can't just do what I've been doing, which is kind of hollering about it. There has to be a practical reason in their interest for people in power to make the right decision. And that requires creating an incentive for it. And I think part of it is, in my mind anyway, is understanding that the perfect cannot be the enemy of the good, understanding that it's a damn miracle we've gotten this far. I mean, I don't know about you all. If I do the right thing 51% of the time in the course of a day, that's a hell of a good day, and I don't have many. I really don't. I wish I did, but I don't. So why would the country be any different? Because a democracy is an entirely human enterprise, governed by rule of law, trying to create an infrastructure where we check our appetites and our ambitions, but there's a reason it's so hard to get anything done, and that's because the founders realized we were fallen, frail, and fallible creatures. And so I think, there's very boring stuff, though important, gerrymandering commissions, not letting the state legislature, with all respect, draw.
John means gerrymander.
No,
He's
I
trying-
don't, and he brought it up. The only reason Elbridge Gerry is known is because of that salamander district. And people like Haslam have decided to call it gerrymandering.
Okay, stop. We're going to have a vote. Would you please raise if you think it's gerrymander, would you raise your hand? If you think it's gerrymander, would you raise your
Gerrymandering.
hand? Okay.
What is wrong?
Thank you.
But this is my
Democracy.
No.
Respect the will of the that was not.
This is my point. We're in flight from fact. Look it up. Elbridge Gerry. I knew we were going to get off on that at some point. But that matters. It matters because the people Mark's talking about, if they don't have centrists in their district, why would they listen? Why would you listen? If you're Marjorie Taylor Greene, I used to cover that district, the 9th District of Georgia. She's got a 95% strongly approve of Trump. 95% think the Democrats are awful. So, I mean, she's a bad example, but there are only like 40 swing seats in the House of Representatives. 40, 10%, less than 10%.
Yeah.
So it sounds incredibly boring, but it would have a big impact.
John, can I, 4 years ago, you wrote a book called The Soul of America, where you basically said, we've been through lots of hard times before, but we've gotten through them. Do you still believe in the soul of America?
Absolutely. Of course I do. I think that the soul, in my mind, is not all good or all bad. It's an arena of contention where our worst instincts do battle against our better angels. And if we can get it right just enough, then the national enterprise continues to be worth defending and fighting for. But it doesn't happen by itself. And what do we celebrate? What do we commemorate? One of the great stories, I think, about life, and I think about this all the time in my own life, is 3 days after Bloody Sunday. So on March 10th, 1965, it was Wednesday, LBJ has George Wallace come to the Oval Office. He sits him down. Johnson had the couch in the Oval Office with very soft cushions, so anybody who sat on it would sink down. And he would loom over them in this tall or rocking chair. And Bill did this too when he was governor. And he leaned over him. And he said, George, what do you want your tombstone to say? George Wallace he hated or George Wallace he built? That's a pretty important question. What do we want said of us? That we built? That we preserved what President Reagan called the last best hope of man on earth, which I actually believe this is? Or we decided for a variety of cultural, political, and economic reasons in a given moment that we'd prefer a kind of authoritarian system. You ask who the best hero, who some of the people are, and what you should hold up to your students, hold up the Secretary of State of the state of Georgia. We have the tapes. The President of the United States called and said, I need 12,000 votes. I need to find 12,000 votes. And he stood there and he said, no. That's citizenship. That's doing your duty.
I'm not going to let you off that easy, and I don't know how much longer we're going to go, but we've been going about an hour. But I want to keep you on this topic for just a little more on solutions, because I think it's important for these young people that we talk about that. I think this is important. Was it Joseph Ellis that wrote Founding Brothers, by the way? I love the book. I use it in my class. And there's a part in there where he, at the beginning of the book, explains how the founders were able to do this amazing thing, start this country, despite the fact that many of them despised each other, and they had severe political fights, and it was ugly. It was very ugly. And I'm simplifying, but what he essentially says is, despite the fact that they were enemies at times, They knew each other personally. They knew each other's families. They asked about each other's families. And because of that personal connection, they were able to work through their problems. And my question for you guys is, when I first went up to Washington, there were the old bulls up there, the Paul Simons of the world, and these guys who didn't matter which side of the aisle they were on, they were willing to listen to the other side. They were friends with the other side. When they disagreed vehemently, but they knew each other. They went out to dinner with their wives. They were friends. I don't think, and John, you're probably the closest to this. I've been out of Washington 20 years, but I don't sense that happens anymore. And am I correct that is a big problem for us right now in terms of our leadership?
You are 100% right that it's gone and it's a problem. Legislative days are Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. A lot of folks sleep in their offices to save money. Remember, Barbara Bush told me a fabulous story. George H.W. Bush was elected to Congress from the 7th District of Texas in 1966. He served 4 years. And she said that at barbecues, soccer games, Little League games, she knew who the other members were, but she didn't necessarily know if they were Democrats or Republicans. She thought Daniel Roskentowski was a Republican for a long time because he and President Bush were so close. And she just guessed they'd sat together or something. And it does matter. It's not that there's some Valhalla period, not that. But I've spent a lot of time on this historically. For instance, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt really liked each other. They liked spending time together. Did that matter? It kind of did. In June of 1942, Tobruk falls, Rommel's on the march. We have about 300 Sherman tanks left in the United States. Churchill is in the White House, staying. He used to stay for weeks. It drove Eleanor crazy, but that's okay. And in one of the great moments of and this is a boys' school. This is my advice to you in spousal management eventually. Never invite the Prime Minister of Great Britain and 50 of his aides to stay in your house for Christmas, and don't tell your wife until that day. Write that down.
It also was a factor that the Prime Minister used to not always have all of his clothes on.
He didn't have his. No, that's true.
So one time when the president came in, and he can say, "Well, you can see, Mr. President, I have nothing to hide."
Exactly. And FDR later said to his own secretary, "You know, Grace, he's pink and white all over." So you don't want to think about Thatcher and Reagan in that zone at all, or Bush and Blair. But it mattered on the margins because he was in the White House. FDR saw the pain on his face, and he sent him a bunch of tanks. And if that had been a matter of cables and negotiation, no, it never would have happened. So, and maybe it just matters once. But that one time, to go to what y'all have said about Senator Baker, I'd suggest that the best of America happens when that one time, the person you disagree with, and they stand up and you're already preparing your tweet saying they're trying to ruin America. And my only request is before you hit send, at least listen to them. And if at the end of their speech you think they're trying to ruin America, then hit send. But I bet one time out of 50, you might think, that son of a bitch may have a point. And I'd suggest that the best of America happens when you think, that son of a bitch may have a point.
Two comments. One, always be aware of collateral damage. A lot of that, the reason that folks don't know each other is like we've said, hey, we elect you. We want to see you in our home district. And so nobody plays Little League in Washington anymore because you'd catch too much grief from your constituents. I saw that in Tennessee. For good reasons, we passed laws to not let lobbyists take out people to dinner. But the problem was that's how people got to know each other before. And so when I was governor, Chrissy and I would have groups of legislators over to dinner, and I was always shocked how little they actually knew each other, unless they happened to, some sort of circumstance. So that's the first. The second thing I'd say is this in terms of advice to students, and since that was kind of the question, what you do is, John teaches a class regularly at Vanderbilt. Sometimes I occasionally I'll go there, and I'm always struck by how early everybody has their weapons drawn. I'm thinking these classes, like you have, not me, but John will bring in Doris Kearns Goodwin, and all these incredibly bright people, and the students come so certain of their conviction, they're waiting to jump the first chance they have. And I'm thinking, you're wasting this incredible opportunity to learn. Now, you might listen the whole time and go, still not sure I agree with you, but I learned something. But if you are a student and you're getting to take advantage of this incredible institution and you're going to get to go to another great one after this, take advantage of that to learn instead of just, I'm here to win the argument.
What kind of things could you guys just conclude with? And that last point is a good one. I see this in my class. These kids come, and it doesn't matter whether they're coming from the left or the right. They come in, and they've got very specific beliefs about things. They don't always know what they don't know, which is a dangerous thing. But they're never uncertain about it. And when I ask them where they get their news and their facts, it's very limited. It's from mom and dad, and it's from whatever pops up on Facebook. So I try to tell them, you really need to get disparate sources of news. You need to hear from the left. You need to hear from the right. You need to make up your own mind. But I'd like you guys to kind of close with some advice for our young people about going forward in high school and in college and in a path they can take where they can be the kind of citizens who can address these issues down the road.
Three quick things. One is going to sound as if Mr. Gioia made me say it, but he didn't. We just come from the same mountain gene pool. As you all know, we both went to Sewanee, which is best understood as Downton Abbey meets Deliverance. So we were more on the Deliverance side. I got to tell you. One is read everything you can. That's not news. If you only read All the King's Men, your life will be better. You will be a better citizen because you will understand that you can only make bricks with mud. And great people do horrible things. Read biography because if it's done well, it reminds you that these monumental figures were frail and flawed, and they are monumental because they did something right for 15 minutes. If Winston Churchill had been hit by a car in 1938, he would be remembered as a kind of erratic guy who might have been on the right track about Hitler. But he endured. He was 65 years old when he finally became prime minister. He said, I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and all my life had been but preparation for this hour and for this trial. I was sure I should not fail. He was the only person who was sure he wouldn't fail. He was this erratic figure, but he was exactly right on the biggest thing in a millennium. If you're going to be right about one thing, opposing Nazi Germany is the one. Abraham Lincoln, totally a creature of his era in terms of his views about race and economy and power. And yet, for 15 minutes, he emancipated and set us on a course toward a more perfect union. If he had died in 1859, if he had died in 1862, before September, he would have been seen as this white apologist. Instead, he's our greatest president. Not perfect, but our greatest. So read biography, read. And just because you have an opinion doesn't mean you have to express it. And that is advice that I do not take in my own life. But I'm trying.
Senator Baker's father-in-law was Everett Dirksen, who was the Republican leader of the Senate when he first came in. You get to give the first time Baker gave a speech on the Senate floor, he went on a little longer than his father-in-law thought he should have. And when he walked off, he walked back to Dirksen's office, which would one day become his office as a Republican leader. And he said, well, what'd you think? He said, He said, son, occasionally allow yourself the luxury of an unexplained thought. So here's the thing, and John, I think, touched on it real well. If I was speaking to students, I'd say this is, I've gotten, not as well as John has, but I've gotten to know most of the last presidents, most of the political leaders, and they are broken and imperfect people just like we are. And the more you're around them, the more you think, wow, I can't believe all this works. Most people who you talk to who get elected to the Senate say they spend the first year saying, I can't believe I'm here, and they spend the rest of their year saying, I can't believe they're here. Okay, because that's just kind of what it's like.
That's 100% correct.
But John's heard me tell this story before, but it's a really important one to me for this reason. Every year, the President of the United States, whoever it is, has all the governors to the White House for an incredible, 5-course, black tie dinner. It's really nice. Marine band plays, et cetera, et cetera. And most of the cabinet is there, the vice president's there, spouses, et cetera. It's just a really incredible night. One night, it's always fun to see who you're sitting next to. One time I'm sitting next to someone who, I won't say their name, but they were a long-time diehard Democrat, had been with Obama through the first campaign and the whole time. This was their last year in office. And I said, what do you know now that you wish you'd known when you came here? He said, I wish I'd known how hard this is. I wish I'd known how complex the decisions are. He said, I wouldn't have been nearly as hard on George W. Bush. He said, don't get me wrong, I still disagree with him on so many things, but I had no idea how hard this is. And that was my experience in government too, is we weren't deciding between good things and bad things. We were deciding between, one good thing and another good thing, and we couldn't pay for both of them. Or we were deciding on something that was going to negatively impact these folks and help these people. It's more complex and harder than you think. So if you're a student, as you complete your learning here and you go on to college and you become, an involved member of society, I hope you'll approach it with some grace for those folks in office, because grace is a word that we've kind of lost the beauty of, and we've taken to this idea that my job is to win the argument. And I would argue that your job is to get to the right answer, and in the process to show some grace to those folks around you who are trying to figure it out just like you are.
The other important book to read is called Faithful Presence. Bill has written a really important book about faith and politics, and everyone should engage its arguments.
That's great advice, guys. Let's hear it for our guests tonight. We appreciate you being here. I guess we're done. Thank you very much, all of you.
Well done.
Hey.
Well done. You were good.